Welcome to episode 111 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with master teachers Tamara Russell and Sarah Plumatalo about things that they're doing that are truly effective in their work with students in Title I schools. Visit truthforteachers.com to get a summary of key takeaways for this episode or to share your thoughts in the comments. So today I've invited two current teachers onto the show to talk about what they're doing with their students. This is something that I hope to do on the show more often because I think it's just another angle of expertise that is important for you to hear as a teacher, rather than always just hearing from quote-unquote experts like myself and others who aren't doing school-based work currently. These two ladies that you're going to hear from today are in the trenches, so to speak, and they're doing it on a daily basis. And they also share about their work on social media and their blogs, which is where I first connected with them. Tamara Russell is a national board certified middle childhood generalist, and she has 20 years of teaching experience. She's currently a third grade teacher, a blogger, and a speaker in Central Florida. Sarah Plumatalo is currently teaching ESOL students in grades 2 to 5 in a Title I school in Northern Virginia, and she runs a federally funded after-school program that serves 150 students in grades K to 5. Because we do talk about race and culture in this episode, I'll also mention that Tamara is Black and Sarah is white, so that you have that piece of information to help you understand the lens through each one views her work. Sarah and Tamara are super close friends, and I've had the privilege of connecting with them on Voxer for the last couple of months, where we have had countless conversations about an issue that we're all very passionate about, which is education equity. They have shared so much wisdom with me in these private conversations on Voxer that it just started to feel like a shame that no one else was getting to listen in. So I invited them both on the show so that more educators can learn from their experiences. Our conversation ended up running for over an hour. And when I went back through the recording to edit it down, I realized that 90% of it was just too important to cut. And so I made the decision, for the first time ever on this show, to air almost the entire interview and to split it into 2 episodes. The first half hour of our conversation was focused on classroom-based work, and the last 20-25 minutes or so was focused on building trust and relationships with families. So that's how we're going to divide things up. I'm going to let you listen in now on the first portion of our conversation about classroom-based work in Title I schools. And these strategies are also appropriate, by the way, if you're not in a Title I school, but do work with some students from low-income backgrounds. And then you can tune in to next week's episode to hear the conclusion of our conversation, where we delve more deeply into the family and community connection. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 things that real teachers, the 2 of you, are focusing on in high poverty classrooms that actually get results. The first thing that we're going to talk about is getting student buy-in for high expectations by skipping the gimmicks and teaching in authentic, culturally responsive ways. So I don't want to equate teaching in high poverty schools with teaching kids of color because those are not one and the same, but there can be overlap, and I don't want to talk about an issue as expansive as poverty without addressing how kids of color are impacted and how to teach them in culturally responsive ways. So we'll get to that part in a moment, but I want to start off with something that I hear both of you say constantly about your work with kids, something that I think is at the heart of your teaching philosophy, and that is letting kids know that they will be successful and there's no other option. Can you speak a little bit to that about getting the student buy-in for high expectations by letting them know they will succeed?
Sure. I feel like with mine particularly, I have a we don't fail culture. I mean, I talk to them about it in the first week of school, and I'll say, we just don't fail. If you take a test in the classroom and you fail, then I'm going to reteach it and I'm going to retest it. I'm going to find a way to reach you. Because it's my job to teach you. It's not my job to let you flounder in school. I'll say things like we grow, we learn, we recalibrate, we readjust. If we don't do something well, that's okay. But we need to have a posture of always moving forward. So what's the most that we can get out of the experience? I want my kids to always know that I'm always here for their academics. I'm always here for emotional support. I don't think it's acceptable for them to not be as good as they want to be. That's my thinking on that.
Yeah, I think that I think that teaching students to learn that the only failure is a missed opportunity for growth. When I was a classroom teacher, of course now I'm an ESOL teacher. When I was a classroom teacher, I always used to frame my students' difficulties as an opportunity for growth. Here is what you need to work on, and here is what you're already doing well. So how can we leverage what you're already doing well to help you improve the areas where you're showing weakness? And I think if students see themselves in a constant positioning for growth and seeing every opportunity as a learning opportunity, they won't cling to a sense of failure regardless of where they are in terms of above grade level, below grade level, on grade level, or whatever tiered system we put them into or the system puts them into. They will always see an opportunity to go upward and have upward growth because they will see themselves as a constant learner. So I think that's the biggest part of kind of a no failure mindset in my classroom.
So sort of this idea where it's okay to fail, but that's part of the learning process. It's not the final thing. You're not allowed to just get stuck there.
Absolutely.
Yes. And one of the things that I did to explain that to my students is I showed them my own evaluation as a teacher. And I showed them
that's good.
Yeah, I showed them what it looks like, and I showed them that what I start out with at the beginning of the year is not what I should end with, and that in between, the principal's job is to give me some points for growth and some things I'm doing well to continue to leverage. And so I kind of use that idea that everyone is supposed to be constantly growing, and it's not just their job as a student, it's everyone's job as a learner, and you're a learner in every context.
You know, another aspect of getting student buy-in for these high expectations that I notice in both of your work, and that I love and respect in both of your work, is really knowing the kids in your classroom and really responding to their needs rather than what you see on social media that is working in other classrooms. Because what works for another group of kids, just because it's relevant or meaningful or authentic for them, doesn't mean it's going to work for your kids. And also, your kids are not monolithic. They don't all have the same interests, even if they have the same cultural background or same language, whatever. They're not all going to respond to the same things. And I think knowing your kids is part of where this piece of skipping gimmicks really comes in, and thinking about cultural responsiveness through a lens of the actual kids in your classroom. And I know that's something that you're both really passionate about.
Absolutely. I think I've said this so many times, but it is not necessary to stand on chairs and use hip hop to teach kids in poverty. And I mean, I'll say it again, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it again.
Because and louder for the folks in the back.
And louder for the folks in the back. It is part, to me, when I see it as an educator, I see it as part of the celebrity culture of teaching. I think it's for clicks and likes. I think it's a methodology over the moments that you really need in a classroom to have deep and rich instruction. If it's the music that you're passionate about, and you want to teach children the depth to which that music comes from, the pain, the joy, the historical context in which it comes, because you want to open your students' minds to not only just the music, but the history behind it, and the real relationships that took place between groups of people to foster this music. If you're for that, then please, by all means, if you would like to juju on that beat, go ahead and do it. But if you don't even understand where the music is coming from, and you're picking up music that these children know the lyrics to, and they're explicit, I just don't see how that educates students. I'm so grateful that there are people that are saying, hey, let's find all the ways that we can to reach these kids. But does it have to be in a way that that's not organic to you as a teacher? If it's not your music, maybe you can reach them with your music and say, this is my music and I'm sharing it with you. Why don't you share your music with me? I'd much rather see students organically creating music to their own music that resonates with them than
Right.
seeing
Yep.
them pattern mimic off of a teacher who doesn't even understand their music, or is appropriating the culture just for clicks and likes.
Yeah, and I'll kind of double down on that because, like, even if it is your music, I would consider myself a fan of rap. I've always listened to rap. If I'm going to pick something in my iTunes playlist, I'm going to pick that over just about anything else. But I have never used it in my classroom because there are a lot of things to consider. And the first thing I consider is, would I play the song if I didn't change the lyrics? And if I wouldn't do that in my classroom, I'm not going to trade upon that artist's music and change it because I want to take advantage of that opportunity. That's the first consideration I make. The second consideration I make is, are my students, are they driving this decision making? Because when you see these teachers that are dancing on chairs and are changing the lyrics to rap music, they are the center and the focus of the classroom, not their students.
Exactly.
The students aren't the ones that are driving it. It's the teacher teaching them lyrics to a song that they wrote using the music of usually a Black or brown person. And to me, that misses the point of tapping into that music and movement piece of learning. Because if the students aren't driving it, it's just memorization by another name. And so I think just thinking about the instructional value alone, it's limited. And that's not even to say about the cultural implications of wearing a culture as if it's a costume when it suits you and when you can use it as a gimmick for your students. I think there's a lot of layers to this discussion, but I think first and foremost is that a gimmick isn't going to reach your kid. A relationship is. And a relationship isn't made through you being the one on the stage, dancing around, repeating lyrics that you wrote that have no connection to the child. So I think that there are a lot better strategies you can use to make those connections to then increase their overall success and performance that don't involve these cultural appropriations that are happening.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of these things that you do, Sarah, that you feel like are better ways to connect with kids.
The first month of school, and beyond, but really the first month, I employ the 2x10 strategy. And the 2x10 strategy is 2 minutes a day for 10 days in a row with a student to build a relationship. During those 2 minutes that you talk one-on-one and give that child your full attention, during those 2 minutes, you do not talk about school. You are getting to know the child, as a person, outside of their performance, outside of their behavior, outside of all of those things, so that you can see who they are. And you do that every day for 10 days. So I would try and get about 3 to 4 kids, and I would do that every day for 10 days, 2 minutes. So you're looking at 6 to 8 minutes of your day spent on building those relationships with those kids. And then once you've done that for 10 days, you move on to another set of students and another set until you've gotten through all of them. And then you circle back again. And that allows you to get to know things about a student you wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to, while also building a relationship that is out of a context of compliance, and one that you can use in a lot of ways. I was even able to select books for reading groups this way because I would see what the children's interests were, and then I could tailor my selections for teaching so that they were automatically more engaged. So there's applications beyond just the relationship building, beyond better classroom behavior management. There's applications to the academic part through building these relationships too.
Right, because you're getting to know the kids on an individual level. And that what I love about the 2x10 strategy is how manageable it is. I mean, it's 2 minutes a day for a child. You know, you can learn so much about a kid, letting them talk about whatever they want to, you know, just for 2 minutes a day. I think that can really help you inform your whole instruction, and sort of going back to the things that you were saying earlier about, you know, making it more student-centered instead of just teacher-centered, you know, putting on a performance or a show. It can be actually based on who the kids are in your classroom and what and how they want to learn.
Yeah, and
I love that.
It also really helps to build connections with the families too, because then when you see them, you have something to talk about that's beyond your child is passing or failing my class, or your child is well behaved or ill behaved. You have something to talk about that's beyond that.
Tamara, what are some of the things that you do here to get student buy-in?
I love to do activities with my students where they talk about the learning that they're having. So I love morning meeting. That's a big component of what I do with my students every day. I really want them to have an opportunity to share from their own lives, their own perspectives. We do a lot of accountable talk in our classroom because I want to promote active listening. But one of the things that I've really been excited about adding to what I do academically with my students is using Socratic Seminar. And it's basically like a roundtable discussion that the students are having. But I utilize it to promote like current events. So we can use Socratic Seminar and we can discuss things that are relatable to the students. Now, currently I teach third grade. So I want to make the conversations that we're having around social studies to be meaningful. So I try to select things that I feel like they'll relate to. Last year, for example, I did a series of lessons with talking about police brutality and Colin Kaepernick. And I had a classroom full of boys. So the school that I taught in, I only had a class of boys last year, and they were all interested in football. So we talked about why Colin Kaepernick was deciding to take a knee, what were the consequences of that behavior, did we agree with what he was doing, did we not agree with what he was doing, why? And so the students were able to ask each other questions, they were able to defend their positions pro or against what he was doing, utilizing different texts and images that we had kind of put together for the unit. I had them talk about multiple viewpoints. Like I wanted, if they were, let's say, opposed to what he was doing, then I also wanted them to be able to argue for what he was doing and vice versa. So that I felt like was the first time I'd really experienced like Socratic Seminar with my students. And I was excited about what that kind of birthed for my kids and the excitement that they had about sharing what they learned from their own perspective. And then when we took that into writing, my students had so much more breadth to what they were writing because they had tested and proved those theories against what was going on with the other guys in the class. And so this year, I plan on doing the same types of activities with Socratic Seminar, utilizing, that's just one example, but utilizing one current event and then kind of building a unit of study around it where the kids can really talk about what's happening in the world around them and how that impacts them even as a third grader.
You know, I love that you pointed out that this is third grade because I feel like, and you've taught first grade too, is that right?
Yes.
So I feel like these are the kinds of conversations that when I see these discussions come up online, I see a lot of elementary teachers in particular say, nope, I'm not going there. I'm not touching that. My kids aren't ready for it. There's no way to do that in a developmentally appropriate way. So hearing you say that this is a regular part of your classroom, I think is something that might be surprising to some teachers who are listening. What would you say about anyone who's not really sure how to approach this kind of stuff with young kids like that?
I feel that for me, in my positioning, I am a social justice educator. I believe in social justice starting young. I believe that good citizenship starts young. Being able to root out bias, being able to root out privilege, that can start really young. And it doesn't have to be from a perspective of, I'm telling you what to believe. It can be from a perspective of, here's what's out here. What do we believe? Exploring the idea of what do we believe. So when I taught first grade, for example, and I was teaching about Native cultures and the Pilgrims, I pulled out several books and I read to them, and we talked about whose perspective is this book written from? Do you think that a Native person wrote this book? Or do you think that someone who believes that the Pilgrims were strong wrote this book? And by the time I was done with teaching about Native American cultures, like my students were embedded in that. They would say things when we would read the books. They'd start talking about the fact that, oh, well, the Native people were not weak. Why does this picture make them look like they're kneeling? Or why does this You know, why did the author in this book say that for example, like the Pilgrims were helping the native people? I'm like, oh, you know, they're starting to pick up those things. They're starting to look. And that's with first grade level standards. That's not, hey, let me, you know, pull out pictures of police brutality with a 6-year-old.
Right.
That's teaching about native cultures in a classroom. I don't even I stopped doing Thanksgiving feasts in my classroom for that reason, because I felt like it was doubling down on philosophically some things that I don't feel like it happened in that way. And it kind of promotes a culture to me that I feel like isn't organic to what actually happened. So even with your particular standards, with citizenship and things like that, you can always give students wide opportunities to contemplate their positioning. You can always do that, even with first grade standards.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think it's an important point that we want to teach kids to think critically, and we want them to engage on a deep level and be able to answer higher order questions. But about what? When we're asking students to think critically, it's difficult to imagine a better context than evaluating sources of information, or looking for biases, or trying to unpack their own relationship with injustice and things like that. You know, I think Tamara makes a good point about we all at some point have to address Thanksgiving or Columbus. And what a perfect opportunity to unpack the perspectives that are lost in a lot of it.
Exactly.
And you know, here in Virginia, we have to teach about Jackie Robinson. And I think that this is a great way for teachers, at least in my state, and whoever else has to teach about Jackie Robinson as a part of their curriculum, that in his autobiography, he wrote about his complicated relationship with the national anthem and the flag and the pledge. And so what better than a first-person account of that from him to then connect to now with what's going on in the NFL than that? And it's right there in the curriculum, ready and waiting. People have to go a little bit deeper and read between the lines to see the opportunities, but they are there.
They are there, and I will vouch for that 100%, because I had these same conversations with my kids, and I taught from pre-K to third grade. I never taught anything higher than third grade. And so, you know, I just want to affirm everything that you guys are saying, that these conversations about current events and social justice and equity are 100% appropriate to have with kids. And I also want to iterate what you said about how it's not about brainwashing kids or telling them what to think or giving them your bias. It's about those multiple viewpoints. It's about letting them hear different sides of an issue, explore different perspectives, and just asking questions. Like, I feel like that's one of the things that I did more than anything else with my students was, I would put something like some of these issues in front of them and be like, what do you think? Why do you think this person made that decision? Why do you think this person responded like that? How does that make you feel? How do you think this person feels? And really just, coming back to the Socratic seminars is, it's about teaching kids how to think critically and analyze bias, look for slants in different news sources. All of that stuff I just think is so important. And I'm really glad that you brought that up here, because I think it's really important to talk about with all kids.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that is to make sure that students are okay with some level of discomfort, because it is uncomfortable to talk about these things. Yes. It's uncomfortable if you are a third grader to discover for the first time that Thanksgiving was not a happy event. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And I think we have to make sure that we're developing classroom communities in which that discomfort is not something that we shy away from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where it's a safe place to sort of explore that discomfort and sort of get into these issues. This is so good. I could really camp out here on this first point all night, but we have so many other good things that I want to get to. So we've talked about getting student buy-in for high expectations by skipping the gimmicks and teaching in authentic, culturally responsive ways. Another strategy that you both use that you feel like really gets you results in high poverty classrooms is teaching kids how to advocate for themselves their rights and their education. And I'm really, really interested in this point because I feel like I don't hear it talked about enough, especially amongst elementary teachers. So I want to talk about helping kids understand their rights and what they are owed by the school system.
I have really become more of an advocate for this particular point myself in the last, I would say, 5 years. Education isn't what it was, and there's not as many people sometimes to do all of the things that need to get done. And if you're a student that requires support, a student with a 504 or a student that's ESE, there may be some times where there's not a person to offer, there's not a person that can give you that support. And that's unfortunate, especially for the students who are the most marginalized, who need the most support, to not have that. So what I do with my students is when they start out with a 504 or if they become ESE throughout the school year, I actually go over with them what their IEP says or what their 504 says. And so if I'm going to give them a test, we talk about what are the things that are your rights as a student, what are the accommodations that you are to be afforded. And then eventually there's a gradual release model with that. After I've kind of coached them on that and I've shown them the document we've talked about, then I make them tell me, what is your teacher responsible to offer to you right now? And they'll tell me, and I'll say, okay, so now that you know that, what happens if you're not getting that and that's your right as a student? And they'll say, politely, excuse me, ma'am, but if it's a substitute, let's say, excuse me, ma'am, it's my right as a student, according to my 504, to have my test read to me. You'll need to read it to me or I can't take it because it's my right as a student to have that. And in teaching them how to disagree, for example, without being disagreeable, to respectfully advocate for themselves, I think is a strength, particularly with the students that I've been working with, because I feel like a lot of times people are dismissive of kids that I teach because they think, well, they're just loud or they're just brash or they just are defiant to be defiant. Sometimes they're not defiant to be defiant, but sometimes there are times, we talked about that even today in school, there are times where I want them to be defiant. There are times where I don't want them to do the wrong thing. If you're supposed to have an accommodation and you're being given an assessment, you cannot take that assessment without that accommodation. You will refuse to take that assessment because that's your right as a student to be able to do that until you can get accommodated. We work on that a lot, and my students are very versed in what their rights are. It's empowering for them. It's truly, truly empowering.
Yeah, I would just echo that and encourage them not ever to see their accommodations as shameful or as something they shouldn't have to have, but rather seeing them as something that allows them to demonstrate their success and demonstrate how capable they are. That it's not a crutch, it's not a bad thing.
Exactly.
That it is something that allows us to see what you already know about yourself, which is you are successful. But here's what you need in order to show us that you're successful within the parameters we're asking you to. And so things for, my students would be things like, again, read aloud, access to a dictionary, extended time, things being repeated, being in a small group instead of taking a test with the whole class. And I think it's so important that every child know what they are afforded in terms of their education. If they have to take ownership of their learning, we need to allow them the opportunity to advocate for themselves too. Because if we want them to be the best learner they can be, they have to know how to ask for what they need. And if we don't teach them that, how are they to know?
Exactly. If you were gonna have a student, for example, if it was a math test and they needed a calculator, you wouldn't deny a student a calculator. But if a student required extra time to be able to be proficient, then you give them the extra time because it's going to maximize their learning experience. And if the student knows how to ask for what they need, then they're going to get what they need more often than not. If they don't even know what their rights are as students, how can they properly advocate for themselves? If they don't know what they don't know, they can't do any better. So that's why we empower them that way.
That piece about knowing how to ask for it and how to stand up for themselves, I think is really important. One of the things that I encountered a lot with my kids is, every year you have a certain, a handful of challenging kids in your classroom. And I found that a lot of times they would work well with me, but the moment they left my classroom, all bets were off. Like anything could happen. You know, they might be running in the hallway and a teacher would yell at them and it would just turn into this back and forth and this huge meltdown. They'd end up getting suspended because they disrespected a teacher. And they would have conflicts with other adults a lot that I just didn't have with them in my classroom. And I feel like teaching kids how to sort of navigate the school system, which, you know, in a lot of ways is very compliance based. And, you know, teaching them how to sort of navigate that and how to stand up for themselves in a way that will allow them to be heard, I think is really important. Have you guys, am I off track here with this?
No, absolutely not. I agree. I think that it is really hard for some of our students who are making, I was just talking to another person about this the other day, they make life decisions for themselves at their ages that I probably didn't make till I was 15 or 16 years old, outside of the school. And then when they come to school and they feel like, oh, I'm late to specials and I'm going to run because I don't want to be, you know, I don't want to miss out on my class, and somebody tells them they can't run, they're frustrated with that. And so they yell out or they say something to an adult that's snarky and rude. They don't realize that they're being snarky and rude. They're just thinking, I'm trying to get to, you know, do the next best thing, and you're interrupting me from doing that. So when you stop them and you say, listen, if you want to go this way, we want to get you to go this way, but there's a way to do that. There's a language and a culture to school that if we can give them that roadmap, then they'll be successful and they'll be able to get to the goals that they want. But they're going to have to learn what is that language and culture of school, which, like you said, Angela, is compliance. And sometimes, you know, sometimes they're really going to need to just comply and not have anything told to them. You know what I mean? Sometimes it can't be explained. And that's something that I teach my kids too. Not every adult is going to stop and talk to you like I would and try to explain the why behind it. Sometimes you just have to do it and then come back to me later and say, hey, listen, I did what this adult said, but I'm not too sure about that. I didn't like how they asked me, or I didn't feel good about it. Okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why that wasn't working for you, and I can work them through it. If they feel like I'm a person that they can trust. But the language of school is compliance. The way that we get kids to be compliant, though, sometimes is what the problem is in public school, and not every person is always equipped with all of the tools, I think, on day one to be able to deal with, you know, students who struggle with compliance. It's hard. It is hard to be marginalized as an adult at a school.
Yeah. What you tell your students to do is exactly what I taught my kids to do. Like, there are just certain teachers where it's like you are wasting your breath if you try to even explain your position with that teacher. And I think sometimes you just got to level with kids and say, you know what, do what they say, follow the direction, and then come back to me. I will be a safe person for you. I promise to always listen. I promise I will always hear you out. I will listen to your side, and I will help you advocate for yourself. And sometimes that is just the approach that they have to take in order to survive. And I think, you know, that aspect of personal responsibility where, like, I can't control what happens, what other teachers do, what administrators do, what other people in the building do, but I can make myself a safe person for these kids and say, okay, I will listen to you and I will help you figure out what is the best course of action here so that you don't have to get into these kind of conflicts with other adults in the building.
Right, because they're 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds. They're learning still how to communicate with their peers, let alone with an adult over a conflict. And I think sometimes it can be difficult for even us to try and talk to our colleagues about these situations. And so if we're uncomfortable as adults, or we have differing perspectives and conflict as adults, we can't expect every kid to respond the same in every scenario. And I think what you said about the safe person and making sure they know that you can work through it with them, that's really the key. And that's where, if you circle back to that trust and that relationship, they are only going to do that if they know that you care about them beyond a test score, beyond a report card, beyond any of that. They're not going to trust you with that vulnerability unless you have that relationship.
There's one more piece here that I want to touch on before we move on. One more piece of this teaching kids how to advocate for themselves. And that is, I kind of want to explore this issue of college or career prep and helping kids see themselves in these roles. How do you guys feel about that?
I would say, it's really important to remember that not every kid has to go to college to be successful.
Amen.
And if we only talk to kids about college as an option, like that there's nothing else that they can do, that's limiting. I feel like, a couple years ago, I read an article about a coach a college coach called John Calipari, and I read about him because he became synonymous with the idea of one and done, which is students go to the college where he is the coach for 1 year, and they play for 1 year. They attempt to win a national title, and then they leave their collegiate experience and they go straight into the NBA. And he is probably the most prolific at this kind of system, where he brings kids in for a year and transform and puts them out. And at first that was really offensive to me as a teacher, because I felt like, man, I loved my collegiate experience. I wish every kid could have that collegiate experience. But what I think he's capitalized on, what he understands, is that kids need to know that you are about their goals. Like, what is it that they want? And I think that's why the kids that he coaches loves them so much, because he's not about enlarging his own brand by having kids go to school for 4 years if that's what makes him look good as a coach. What he's best at is getting the best players in the country to come play for him and then go have amazing careers in the NBA. And that's because that's what they want to do. They want to be amazing NBA players. And so how do I translate that into the classroom with students? I talk to them about what they want to be. And I never laugh when a kid says they want to play basketball. I don't care if they trip over their shoelaces every day. Sure, honey, what's that going to look like for us to be able to get you there? What do you need to do? What are the things you need to be able to do? And then you talk to them about those things, and you set measurable goals that they can see kind of be unpacked throughout the school year so that they can make steps forward. Now, I changed my career path probably 25 times, but from third grade on to graduating from high school myself. That doesn't matter. The teachers that actually believed that I wanted to be a doctor and started to work with me on science and started to work with me on different things are teachers that resonated with me because they saw something in me. They believed in me as a person. And so I try to translate that to my students as well. It doesn't matter to me if you go to college. I want you to grow up and be the best at whatever you want to be. Help me help you get there. So that's been my philosophy for the last couple of years. And like I said, I actually learned from somebody that initially I didn't really like I felt like I understood his philosophy and I didn't like it. But now I see how that works on a classroom level, and just changing and shifting in that way and being more about what my kids would like to be about for themselves has really helped me to deepen my relationships with them and give them lots of options for what they want to be when they grow up.
That's good stuff. So once again, it's all coming back to knowing your kids. It's coming back to those same relationships, not, doing what you think you should do for them, not trying to make them into who you think they should be, but really tapping into who they are as individuals and helping them figure out their own goals. I love all of that. So we've talked about the classroom-based aspect here, and I'm going to let Truth for Teachers listeners hear the remainder of our conversation in next week's episode, which is about how to earn trust with families in poverty and empower parents as our educational partners. You can find Sarah Plumatalo in the meantime on social media. Her resources are called Sarah Plumatalo's Resources for Diverse Learners. And you can find Tamara Russell in all the social media spaces under the name Mrs. Russell's Classroom. I highly encourage you to follow both of them on whichever platform you prefer, be it Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, so on. And stay tuned for next week's episode in which they announce a new podcast of their own called Equity. Have a fantastic week. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Truth for Teachers is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. For more great podcast recommendations, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. That's edupodcastnetwork.com.